Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Premal Dharia, James Forman Jr., and Maria Hawilo, the three co-editors of the new book, Dismantling Mass Incarceration. The conversation is moderated by David Ball of Santa Clara University School of Law. Thanks for joining us. Our YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. Tonight's panelists each have impressive professional biographies, but I will be brief in my intro so that we can jump into the conversation. Premal Dharia is the Executive Director of the Institute to End Mass Incarceration at Harvard Law School, which aims to draw together organizers, scholars, activists, policymakers, lawyers, and students who are committed to new approaches to ending mass incarceration and to undoing the effects of decades of unjust criminal laws and policies. James Forman Jr. is the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale Law School, whose scholarship focuses on schools, police, and prisons, and the race and class dimensions of those institutions. His first book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America, was awarded the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. Maria Hawilo is Distinguished Professor in Residence at Loyola University Chicago School of Law and focuses her teaching and research on the criminal justice system and its vast overreach and disparate impact on Black and Latino individuals. David Ball works primarily in the field of criminal justice, writing and teaching in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, sentencing, and corrections as a full-time member of the Santa Clara University School of Law faculty. I'm honored to welcome all four of these panelists to FAN.
Well, thank you very much, Lonnie. So I'm going to get us started talking about this book. And so I want to start with a really basic question. What exactly do we mean by mass incarceration?
Well, first of all, thank you, Lonnie. Thank you, the Family Action Network. And thank you, David, for being in conversation with all of us. And thanks to all of you who are joining us tonight. We're excited to be here and excited to be in conversation with all of you. I think that's both a really important question and a really complicated one to answer. Over the years, people have said that it applies to the vast over-incarceration of people in this country, particularly disproportionately impacting people of color, African-American men. I think basically it means how we use our criminal system as a tool to lock up more and more people without actually providing the help that people need to sustain their lives, their families, their livelihoods. There's an overreach that extends beyond the prisons and the jails to include surveillance, so mass surveillance. So I think it means all the ways in which we use our criminal systems in ways that are unjust, unfair, and racialized.
I mean, I wonder if you all can situate our system of incarceration either within the history of the United States, right, and the sort of hockey stick growth that happened in the 70s and 80s, or worldwide for people who aren't familiar with it, like just how much of an outlier are we compared either to ourselves in the past or to the rest of the world right now?
I can jump in. And I want to echo Maria's thanks to all of you for hosting us, and to you, David, and to everyone attending. We are an outlier. I mean, that's the right word. The United States is a leader in the world in incarcerating people. I think that for a long time, we've been the #1 incarcerator of people per capita in the world. I understand that we might have just dropped to #2. But we are still right up there and leading the way in the violence and harm of incarceration. In terms of numbers, there are about 2 million people that are incarcerated in the United States. That doesn't capture the number of people that enter the doors of jails every day. Many of whom don't necessarily remain incarcerated, but the sort of what's called churn of people coming in and out of the system every day of the year is tremendous. I can't tell if I just froze for a sec. So the numbers are staggering. They are out of line, with norms across the world. And as you mentioned, this boom sort of happened in the 70s and 80s, but the roots of our system of mass incarceration are deep, right, and go back much farther than that. It's the sort of the prison boom happened in that time frame, but the network of forces that Maria was describing, surveillance, all of it, right, all of it stems from much deeper roots that are historical and date back to the legacy of slavery that our country is built upon and more.
So I wonder if we could drill down a little bit more into that about how we got where we are. So sort of what the history is behind mass incarceration, and what were the sort of choices or policies or attitudes or politics that really enabled it.
Oh, that
Referring to
I mean
everybody
that
else. So, yeah.
that's a big question. Like
Yeah.
there's many books that have been written about that. So I think that's a difficult question to answer in the context of a conversation like this one. But there were, right, there have been many forces that have helped to contribute to create the system that we have now. So one, the United States has always been this concept of kind of rugged individualism, this idea that, you rise and fall on your own. The government is not going to be there to help you. And if you make a mistake, you're to blame. It's not society. It's not the failure to provide any services to you or provide opportunity. It's choices that you made. So, right. So that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years into the American ethos. It has religious dimensions. People have written about that. Then obviously race and racism play a central role as well in the rise of mass incarceration. Lots of people, most famously Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, have written about how it was when other systems of social control were challenged and in some ways were overcome or abolished that mass incarceration came into existence, right? So that's clearly part of the story. There's also a question of path dependence, right? We build this system up in the 60s and 70s especially, and it becomes the default for what we know as a country. It becomes a default when we think about how do you want to respond to crime. People's instincts are, well, we better mobilize the police. We better mobilize prosecutors. We better mobilize prisons. And then because those systems exist, right, to the exclusion of other possibilities, when crime goes up and people look around for what to do, they go back to the systems that already are around, because doing nothing is not an acceptable option for most people. So the very fact that these systems have come into being then justifies their continued existence. So those are, I would say, some of the forces. And I think the last one that I would put on the table that's related to what I just said, but it really an extension of it, is a broader failure of imagination that we have in this country to think about what some alternative approaches would be, right? All three of us think about harm, and however we define it, whether we call it crime, whether we call it harm, whether we call it violence, whatever the word you want to use to describe the set of problems that bring people fear and that people want a response to. People deserve a response. People deserve the state to take action. People deserve the state to support community groups to take action on their behalf. But as a nation, we have failed to imagine other alternatives to police, prosecution, and prison. And this book is about those people that do have that broader imagination. This book is about that universe of people that is trying to get us to be able to see that there are different approaches that we could take. And that's what you'll find in these pages.
Yeah, great. I mean,
And
so
if I
that's,
could, Maria.
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to that. I mean, everything that James just said, absolutely. And I would just say the way the book is structured is in direct response to questions and to James's last point. And that is, folks want to say, look, the police have everything to do with mass incarceration. And so we're going to just blame the police because they can arrest all the people, but then you realize the prosecutors are actually making the charging decisions in the end, and the police can only arrest. And the judges are acting or failing to act oftentimes to prevent some of these unlawful arrests and so on. And so the book is structured in such a way to sort of show how each of the actors in the system, each of the parties that could be responsible, and in fact are part of the causes here, can also help and provide sort of interventions, opportunities where they can help end this crisis. It's a crisis of both incarceration, it's a crisis of imagination, it's a crisis of education and public health, because the system touches on all of those vectors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's dig into that, actually. So I have a couple of questions each about one of the sections of the book. And so I won't label them necessarily, but we start with police, and you all have mentioned police. And so, you know, I want to just sort of tee up, like, we ask police to do a lot right now. And I'm wondering, you know, what do we ask of police now, and what should we ask them to do, right? So what other, or put another way for people who maybe aren't familiar with the book, or alternate responders or community violence interrupters or things like that, what other ways can we deal with social problems with frontline responses? And can you all sketch that out for people who are maybe not familiar with them?
Yeah. So, you know, we've talked about the structure of the book, and the first chapter, the entry point to the criminal legal system, is about police. And just sort of as a bigger picture note about the approach that we took with this book, was that in each chapter, we really wanted to tee up conversations and tee up kind of engagement with perspectives or approaches that might challenge, you know, anyone, including someone who has a different perspective or approach or thinks they do, to think in a deeper way, to listen to other people's perspectives, and to try to sort of engage in that way. So each chapter kind of takes a variety of perspectives and puts them together with the hope that someone could pick up this book, even someone unfamiliar with these issues at all could pick up this book and read the chapter on police and be like, oh, okay, these are a variety of different approaches to police in the United States, and begin to develop or continue to develop their own thinking about what their approaches might be or their perspectives might be. So I just want to kind of offer that as an entry point to saying that in the police chapter, we offer a variety of quite different perspectives on what police should do or should not do. Right? The book opens with an excerpt from Derricka Purnell, who is, you know, explicitly an abolitionist and doesn't believe that we should have police engaged in any way as it relates to communities. And then there are a variety of other perspectives about the role of police, or what it should or should not be. And then there are perspectives about ways that policing can be shrunk, essentially. And so no matter kind of what your ultimate vision is of the role of police, bigger picture, or in the very far future, we included a variety of approaches to policing that call for them to shrink in some way, that call for the number of encounters that police have with people in neighborhoods, in cars, to become smaller. And the reason for that is that I think we can, you know, across the board, I think there's a broad understanding that police are being asked to do way too much, and that police are engaging in a way with community members that is often menacing, that is sometimes violent, and that is sometimes fatal. You know, the police violence has not abated in recent months or years, and the depth of police violence in this country has made this issue something that lots of people have increasingly become attuned to and interested in talking about. And so we offer in the book excerpts that address a couple of different, you know, policy changes and approaches that sort of address this. One is the creation of alternative first responders, and that, you know, many jurisdictions are implementing these kinds of programs in which people who are not police, who are not armed, militarized police, are called upon to respond to the kinds of things that currently police are the only people available to call in many places, for mental health crises, substance use crises. You know, the kinds of public health issues that arise where we absolutely, I think, can all agree that we don't need an armed police officer arriving to try to handle it. And so that's been a model that's, you know, been really successful in some places and is continuing to grow around the country and to be explored in more places. The other approach that we include in the book that people might be interested in is around traffic and traffic safety, and thinking about ways to minimize the number of police encounters that happen through traffic stops. Traffic stops are often very dangerous for Black and brown people. They often turn fatal or violent in some way. And just minimizing the number of encounters that people might have when they're driving with police officers who have weapons, it would be a helpful step forward. And so, you know, we talk about alternative ways to manage traffic safety, where I think, again, many people can agree that we don't need armed police officers involved. So those are a couple of the sort of policy changes that are offered up in the book, among a sort of variety of big picture approaches to policing generally, about what the future of policing should look like.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question, if I may. So all of us work at universities, and I would venture that I don't know the particulars about your institutions, but do you all have university police forces? And why do we normalize that if, you know, we know better? I mean, have you all sought to engage with that, or, you know, because there are 20 million people who attend universities right now, and that's a fairly large sector of the public that is being policed, maybe in a way that they don't have to be.
I know one of the things, I mean, this is, I think, only maybe partially responsive, but certainly I know at Yale, where I teach, there's been, for really at least a decade now, there have been student-led movements to call for fewer of the police officers on campus to be armed, to call for exactly what Premal was talking about, an alternative response network, because on university campuses in particular, a lot of what police get called for are issues of mental health. Someone's in mental health crisis, and somebody is suffering from something that grows out of their addiction. And so that hasn't happened yet. I mean, the university is started a task force to examine it. I'm not sure like where exactly that's going to go, but I know students have called for that. And another thing that I guess is connected to, you know, one of the things that Premal just mentioned when she was talking about traffic stops. So one of the arguments that is presented in the article about traffic stops that Premal mentioned is more reliance on automation, right? So more reliance on automated cameras as opposed to live officers. Now, that's a complicated and area that there's lots of back and forth on, right? It's not easy. But I know, for example, on our campus, one of the related pushes was to have badges where people would swipe into the building instead of having to show their ID to a campus officer, on the theory that when people were being asked to show their IDs, not everyone was being asked to show their IDs. There was a selectivity in the enforcement. And if you look like you didn't belong, then you got asked to show your ID. And so, and of course, sometimes people, because of race and class and other things, sometimes people who did belong were asked to show their ID. And so the idea that you would just have this be automated was put forward as a way to reduce the amount of selective enforcement. So those are some of the things ways the conversation has played out on our campus. But I'm not sure. How's it happening at your campus?
Yeah, I had a long and sort of fruitless quest to do that, because I do think that there is this question, and I think it gets to, you know, something that you said, I think, James, earlier on, about the failure of the imaginary, right? Why do we normalize? Why is it police is our answer to these things, right? So sort of for interpersonal problems, or people who are, you know, overdosing, or people who are having mental health crises, right? Do people feel safe about that? I'm persuaded by your colleague Monica Bell about, you know, the sort of stigmatic impacts actually of actually being, you know, in a sort of police-citizen interaction. And it's sort of anathema to, I think, the goal of the university, which is to engage in dialogue and to really question, the sort of received wisdom and to try to see if we can do better. And particularly at a school like Santa Clara, and I assume like Loyola, that, expressly have this sort of Catholic, doctrine of treating the whole person, right? If you ask what would Jesus do, probably not roll up on somebody with, a weapon or something like that, right? So I just feel like that, and I wanted to throw that out there just because I know we have a lot of students on this call, and people have asked a lot of we've gotten some audience questions that are all about what can I do, and I think that just that question of asking like, well, why are we doing this is those big questions are often the ones that emperor has no clothes type moments. But so fascinating, super fascinating. But I want to touch on all the sort of sectors that you all laid out in your book. And so, in your prosecutor section, right? So that's section 2. Paul Butler asked a provocative question: should good people be prosecutors? And I should mention that, as all of you know, but maybe the audience doesn't, Paul was a prosecutor, right? But that was before he wrote that article. But I think there's sort of a push and pull about this, right? Because prosecutors do have discretion constitutionally, but that discretion is typically constrained, particularly early on in their careers, where they have to answer to supervisors and they aren't sort of given free rein to do what they want to do. And then there's a sort of office culture, oftentimes, like there is in every other organization, about this is the way we do things here, right? And so I can think of other examples when, the so-called progressive prosecutor movement, when you had new district attorneys, head district attorneys, who were sworn in and elected, then you had some resistance from longtime prosecutors in that office who would maybe sort of slow walk or, in other ways try to undo that. And so I guess my question is the individual prosecutor, the sort of the right unit of analysis? And if not, how do we think about the prosecution function as a system of itself? And of course, feeding into the other systems that, Maria, you were talking about before, that this is not just a single thing. It's a very complicated, ecosystem.
I think it's less about an individual prosecutor and more about an ethos, a willingness to imagine and to go for the change. And I think this is related to your question of what students confront this issue and they say, well, what can I do? Or the ordinary community member confronts this issue and says, well, what can I do? This is in the news all of the time. People are impacted by it all of the time. And I think they can do a whole lot. For the ordinary person, they can become familiar with who their local prosecutors are and who is running for office and what their values are and whether those values, what I say to my students is, the prosecutor, after all, represents the community's interests. They're speaking in our name, right? With respect to harm or harms against others. And so if you have to find out what it is that their values are and whether those values align with yours. So that's from the outside perspective and organize around that. And people have done it. And I think that's what we're trying to highlight in the book. These aren't just ideas or theoretical ideas. There are people, communities, organizers, advocates out there who are doing exactly this. They're not perfect. It's cyclical. There's backlash, no doubt. But, in various places around the country, we went from prosecutors who enforced the death penalty to prosecutors who didn't. That was a big change. We went from prosecutors who put up conviction review units where there were none before and were willing to admit mistakes. That's a big change. We went from prosecutors who wouldn't try children as adults for the most part to prosecutors where it was almost automatic. These are big changes. And I think, again, it's about sort of the institution and the power it holds and imagining something better. Now, that doesn't fix all of the cultural components I think you raised, David, but this is, in one of the prosecution pieces, Angela Davis says, if all we look for is all or nothing, we're going to get nothing. And so I think the prosecution piece, there's a tension for sure. And Paul Butler gets at that tension. How far are they really willing to go? What is change look like? How do we define success? And then you see, you know, the work that some of the prosecutors are doing, and I think we leave it to the reader to decide.
Can I follow up
It
though
looks-
on like
yeah.
what do we define success? And I know that, you know, Paul Butler's using it slightly differently, but you know, one of the things that that I, you know, always ask my students, right, is, well, conviction rates, if you were going on conviction rates, right, 99% conviction rate might not be good because it means you were only getting the low-hanging fruit, right? And you weren't necessarily taking on the more difficult cases that might be really important, right? So white-collar crime, like those are typically very difficult to prosecute because the people who, you know, are accused of those crimes typically have resources. And so is there what are your all's thoughts about like alternative metrics or alternative frameworks for understanding, you know, how we could evaluate the efficacy or the goals of what prosecutors really should be doing? I mean, I understand that it's reflecting the needs of the community, but we also know that so many prosecutors run unopposed once they get into office, right? So what are some other ways we could say, well, this is what a good prosecutor looks like or might look like? We can imagine, you know, just expanding our vocabulary if we're talking about that.
I think, you know, a couple of things that are touched on in this prosecutor chapter and in some of the excerpts are thinking long term, right? About elected prosecutors are not going to be in office forever, and so what is the future of this office and what's the future of this role? And so thinking about a prosecutor who can implement policies that are durable towards reform, that will outlast that particular prosecutor, right? That will stick and make long-term change, as opposed to something that might be accomplished in a few short years at best, and then either get reversed entirely or shift in priority or importance. So I think that's one mark actually of someone who's thinking in that way and thinking about what real change looks like for the long term. Another is thinking about how prosecutors can address their own roles and whether they are looking to expand their own roles or not, right? And so a lot of prosecutors are seeking to really expand the role of the prosecutor in order to make change, right? Seeking tons more funding, looking to expand their offices and bring on a lot more prosecutors. And in the big picture, what are we doing if that's what reform looks like? What does the long term look like then if we're expanding the criminal legal system in that way and this very core part of the criminal legal system in that way? Whereas there are other prosecutors who understand that the sort of complex nature of durable reform and like really long lasting reform in this regard might be to find ways to shrink or minimize their own roles, and to think about what change looks like with that in mind. And that's complicated, right? That's nuanced and complicated, but I think that's another mark of someone who's really being thoughtful about long lasting change.
I mean, I think that, oh, go ahead, James.
I was just going to put two more just quick things on the table. I agree with everything that Premal said, but here's two things that I would look for any progressive-minded prosecutor that I was going to get behind to say they were going to do. One is what Maria talked about, which is a conviction integrity unit, which is to go back and look at prior convictions and actually have the prosecutor's office take the lead in trying to identify. We're speaking to an audience with a lot of people from Chicago, so I don't need to tell people in the Chicago area about the history of abuse and violence and brutality, which led to people being falsely convicted. And by the way, just as an aside, those prosecutors who oversaw that and allowed that to go on, they don't even deserve the mantra of tough on crime, because every time someone was falsely convicted, it means that the person who did it was still out there and they faced no accountability whatsoever. So that would be number one, conviction integrity. And number two for me would be an extension of that, which would be a prosecutor establishing a sentence review unit. What I mean by that is the prosecutor looking at people in their office who were sentenced in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, especially when extraordinarily long sentences were being given out like candy, and to actually look and say, all right, we're not talking about innocence now, but we're talking about the fact that somebody got a 40 or a 50 or a 60-year sentence, and that was too long. They don't need to be in prison for that length of time. Premal and I were at a book talk last night in Washington, D.C. which is a city that has enacted a second chance legislation. And one of the people that came to the talk was one of my clients from the 1990s who got a 150-year or some crazy sentence, but he got relief under the second chance legislation in DC, and he's out. And he was able to come to the book talk, and he was able to make a contribution. He was able to talk about his job. There are people like that, many of them, dozens, hundreds, languishing in prisons all across America. And the prosecutor's office is one of the institutions, not the only one, but it's one of them that can play a role in giving those people a second chance, which, by the way, strengthens the community that they've come from.
Right. So I just want, I mean, as a follow-on to that, I remember having a conversation with a student of mine who was starting out as a prosecutor in Santa Clara County, and he was giving out 6-month misdemeanor sentences. And I said, oh, okay, but of course, at the end of 6 months, you're going to follow up and make sure that that person was deterred and rehabilitated, right? And all we did was had a sort of bitter laugh about that, right? And so, James, I get you on the sort of very long sentences, but we don't even really have any good evidence that suggests that, you know, even short sentences do something. And something I've been sort of surprised to see is that, you know, for some people, the best thing you can do is nothing. If you take them out of school, you take them, you put them in jail, you take them out of their pro-social, environment, they get worse, right? So it's not, I mean, even that, we want to make sure that we, use it sparingly, if at all. So
There's
I agree,
there's very strong evidence of that.
Yeah,
Very strong
100%,
evidence
right?
that,
Yep.
for
Most
example, in the
criminologists would
juvenile
agree.
system,
Yeah.
there's a study out of Chicago that in the juvenile system looked at 2 groups of young people with the same backgrounds, but just because of lottery got assigned to different judges. One of them got basically on average 45 days of pretrial detention, and the other was released. And they looked at them 5 and 10 years later, and they found that those that got released, that did not get the 45 days, are more likely to have graduated from high school and less likely to have been convicted as adults. So
Right.
You're absolutely right. And 45 days, our system doesn't even talk about that as a problem. We're like, oh, 45 days, that's nothing. That's a slap on the wrist, send them a message. But actually, what it does is it makes your lifetime, your likelihood of succeeding in life, it makes it worse.
Yeah, there's even studies about arresting, right? And the title has something about deviance amplification in it, which would make for a great punk band name. But let's move on. Okay, so we're talking about resources, and you all were public defenders, right? So you all have experience with that, and public defenders often have like very crushing caseloads. They're notoriously underfunded. It's very rare that, I don't even know of one where public defenders' offices are as funded as the DA's offices. And so, it's not often seen as part of good government, right? And here, like, I'll just sort of gesture at, Abby Smith's title of defending those people, right? So it's being seen somehow as, the prosecutors work for us, but the public defenders don't defend the public. And so I wonder if you all can speak either, from your experience about, what the role that public defenders have and maybe how to make the case to somebody who might not be sympathetic that we all should be invested. This is as integral a part of the system as anything else might be, to have like well-funded, good public defenders. Clearly, relating to getting the right person, right, and making sure that we don't have the folks who actually did the stuff be out on the street. But I'm curious, I just welcome your reflection about that.
Well, I'll start. I think, David, as you said, the 3 of us are former public defenders from Washington, D.C., the D.C. Public Defender Service. And we were, pretty well funded and well resourced and supported by investigators and social workers and other mentors and colleagues. And that was an incredible experience for all those reasons, because we can then in turn take that experience and work on behalf of our clients. I think when I first started practicing, the question, and Abby's article is in there, I think partly for this reason, that I get more often than not, anywhere I went, was, well, how can you represent those people? What if your client told you that they did something horrible, would you still stand up in court? And so there was this, and this was a question everyone was asking at the time, not the public defenders, of course, but everyone around. When I started teaching mass incarceration just a few years ago, the question had changed. My students confronted me with the question, how could you have worked in that system? How could you have allowed that system to expand, knowing how racist it is, how harmful it is, how little it does for communities and people it purports to want to help? And that was a question I really had to confront. And I think this chapter, in part, was probably the hardest for me, at least, to sort of take in and to absorb, because I think of the public defender as like the champion, and I know a lot of people don't. But also some of the articles and some of the folks in there rightfully ask the question, well, what is the public defender really doing? And isn't a public defender's office expanding this harmful system? Can we imagine something better? Now, I tend to think that having excellent resources, support, social workers, mitigation specialists working in public defender's office is a good and not a harm. And I think it's necessary beyond a good. I think it's not only a moral question, but it's a necessary institution, and they can hold accountable these other actors. What I'd like to see happen is all of these people do a lot less of what everyone is doing, and you know, focus on addressing and imagining how to address harms in different ways than what we've done.
Premal, James?
I think Maria captured a lot of it. I'll add for going back to your question, that there might be people who don't understand or sympathize with the work of public defense. I would ask folks to imagine that someone you love or care about is arrested, and think about the role of public defenders in that person's experience of the criminal legal system. And speaking as a former public defender, the day that you meet someone who's been arrested is potentially the worst day of their lives. And they're experiencing a million emotions and hardships that are unimaginable to many of us. And it's an incredibly important role because, of course, you're a lawyer who can help mitigate the harm that's happening to that person in a courtroom, to a judge and with a prosecutor, but also because you're a human who can sit with that person and try to help them understand what's happening to them, and try to connect with them, and try to help make this horrible experience a little less painful. And that's that's a really incredible thing. And so I would just urge people to think about it in that way, in that sort of personalized way. That's not about the sterile courtroom where arguments happen about the Constitution, but about a much more intimate experience, and a really, really harmful one.
And I would just say, just to follow up on Premal's point, which I think is so important, I would ask everybody out there to imagine that person that she said, your family member who has been arrested, and what you would want for them. And then think about the person who's portrayed on the news who has committed a crime or arrested and charged with a crime. And why you have a different reaction to the person, your family member, versus the person on the news. It's not just because, of course, we love your family member and you want the best for them. But underneath that is the fact that for your family member, because you've lived your whole life with them, that you would define them not simply by, even if they did the thing that they were arrested for, you're not defining them only as that. You know everything else about them. You have memories of how they loved and treated other people in the family. You've seen them do beautiful things. You've watched them struggle and succeed in school, right? You've seen them play in the backyard and walk the dog and hug the niece. You know all that. You know all of that about them, and you know that they did this thing. And so you put the thing that they did in the context of everything else you know about them. And you think to yourself, okay, well, you know, I would want the best for them. I would want to have a lawyer that could stand up in court and defend them, and also tell the judge and tell the jury the whole context of their life so that they can understand what happened that day and that night in that context. But the person that you see on the news, you don't know any of that. Literally, the only thing you know about them is the thing they're charged with doing. So of course you're like, well, no, forget about them. Like, all you know about them is the crime they committed. So most people are not going to have a loving, empathetic instinct towards that person. And so if you get underneath Premal's hypothetical, you really can start to understand why it is that we need public defenders, because we need people in the system that are going to fight for everybody as if it was your loved one.
Well, I think a lot of this, like that's what Brian Stevenson calls being proximate, to the suffering of others, right? And much as I would love to, speaking of proximity, we are close to Raj Chavayadev, who is like, I've been a big fan, back for a long time, but we'll have to, I want to move on to some of the other sections of your book, but if we have time, I'd like to come back to sort of the non-public defender work that he is doing. But so I want to move on to judges. And, James, you had a conversation with New Jersey bail reformers that is excerpted in the book about judges. And I think I want to use that as a jumping off point. We've had a series, here in California, with bail and other systemic reforms, that while the policy has changed, right? I'm thinking also our Racial Justice Act here. While the policy has changed, it's often difficult to get judges to change the way they are doing things, right? They tend to stick with how they were trained and how they've done things, right? So in our instance, we are allowing lots of evidence in California that were foreclosed by the Supreme Court in McCleskey versus Kemp and U.S. versus Armstrong. That just might not mean anything to the non-lawyers in the crowd. But I'm curious, either James or anybody on this, like, how do we balance judicial independence with also ensuring that judges respond to legislative and policy and other kinds of social changes? What are the ways of respecting judicial independence? Because I do think it's important, but also then in nudging or encouraging or educating judges about alternative ways of thinking about things that might also lead to reduction in mass incarceration.
Well, I just ranted on about public defenders, so I'm gonna let Maria take that one.
All right. Well, I think, while I think independence is an important value, I don't think of judges as neutral, nor do I think that they shouldn't have, and really what we're talking about is education and training. And I think that those are values that we want all the people in the system to have and to share, and people outside of the system to have and to share. So, how do we balance independence with education? I think advocacy and lawyers who know what the policies are or what they should be. I mean, this notion that like we're stuck with whatever policy we have, it sort of lacks this like imagination or creativity that I think we need to see for this system to really change. Aspirational standards aren't always going to be aspirational, right? Somebody has to get up and make the argument about bail and to say, wait, this is unconstitutional, or wait, you can't lock up somebody because they're poor, because that's essentially what this cash bail system is all about. And what I really love about that piece in the book is that, one, you see collaboration between two people who normally don't see eye to eye on these things, right? But look, on one side, they're saying we, the prosecutors, are spending all our time, all our money, all our efforts, locking up people who shouldn't be locked up in the first place. And on the other side, you've got defense-minded folks who are saying, and we're harming everyone, including community members, and we're not helping victims. And I think this is a really important point, and it's not directly addressing your question, David, but one I really want to hone in on a little bit, both on the public defender side and now on the judge's side. I don't, we're not, victims are part of this book in various chapters. Accountability is really important. It's imperative. Addressing harms is important. And public defenders don't just sort of disregard victims in any way, shape, or form. Many of our clients, all of my clients, I can't think of a single one, hadn't been victimized or harmed by crime, by violence, by trauma, and traumatized in all sorts of ways. And so we're close to that. And we're saying, in order to really address this harm, we've got to find different ways, and we have to address the harm, because we can't lock up and imprison and do what, have all this cash bail or whatever the thing is, our way out of the harm and create a safer place that way. We've been trying that for 50 years, like it's failed. So it's time to imagine something new. And that's what we hope the judges, whose opinions we do sort of highlight here, agree with us on.
No, I mean, I'm happy for that diversion. I've actually co-written two amicus briefs to the California Supreme Court about bail from crime victims for safety and justice, right? And it's very much the point that the people who are most affected by crime live with the people who commit it, at least the way, given all the sort of societal forces, right? And so there isn't this sort of distinction between us and them, and so, okay, so, but I do want to touch on like a couple of other sections. So now my question about prisons, right? You have a section about the restoration of Pell Grants in prisons that policy that I was very happy to have worked on in the ABA. And I want to give a shout out to Professor Speart at the University of Pittsburgh, who did a lot of work on that. Even though improving prison conditions is what I've devoted a lot of my professional life to, the title of your book is Dismantling Mass Incarceration, and improving and dismantling aren't necessarily related. And I'm wondering if, you all could, I don't think this is true, but I just want your comments on, if the goal is to work within the prison to make conditions better, again, something that I've spent a lot of my time on, but the goal is also to reduce the number of people who are in prison. And I'm wondering if you all would, just talk about how you think those two are related, to sort of connect the dots for the audience.
I can jump in. So, as I mentioned earlier, the book contains tension in multitudes, and it contains, different approaches to what it means to dismantle mass incarceration, and including this tension that you're sort of alluding to about prisons and improving them, and what relationship that has to ending or dismantling mass incarceration. And that tension is captured is very present in the book. And it's one we hope that people will engage in and talk about. One of the features, a sort of core feature of mass incarceration is the deep isolation and dehumanization that it fosters. It is part of how it operates, right? To isolate people, to remove them from their families and communities, and to keep them from the parts of life and community that allow us to flourish, education being one of them. And so, so prison education programs, I think one of the things that we've talked about, and one of the reasons that we included that kind of, or pieces on that, is that that's also tackling mass incarceration, right? It's not about the numbers. It's not necessarily tackling numbers in a direct way, but it is tackling a core feature of mass incarceration by opening up the possibilities of education and the kinds of sort of engagement that those of us on the outside of prison walls get to have, learning and listening and growing, is a direct attack on mass incarceration itself.
And I just want to say, for people who haven't been to prison and talk to people in prison, right? You go to prison and you talk to people, and it's both hopeful and kind of sad, where you think like, wow, these are such smart people, and this is all just, I mean, it's kind of a waste. Like, I know that's more editorial than anything else, but I've met some extremely smart people in prison who made some bad decisions, right? And so just want to, I would encourage everyone who can to actually go and see for yourself, right, and talk to people. But Premal, that sort of leads me to, another question that I have, maybe the last sort of question that touches on all sections of the book, I want to clean my plate here, but which is that, when we have these sort of reentry and second chance, kinds of questions, we don't do a lot for people while they're in prison, right? We don't do a lot for people to address their underlying mental health problems. We don't do a lot to address their educational deficits. We don't do a lot to address, their substance use problems. And so it seems like that a lot of our, second chance opportunities are not like a second chance at life, but they're a second chance of punishment. You get out, and if you fail once, then, well, you had your chance. Let's send you back there. And I also am thinking about, what James was talking about, right? The labeling theory, where we not only label somebody when they are arrested as that thing, right? But we commonly refer to people who have had criminal justice involvement as ex-felons, as though that is who they are, rather than something that they did. And so I guess, this is, I understand, and again, I have worked a lot on reentry programs, and I'm really about them, but shouldn't our goal really be non-entry, right? Is there a danger if we are focusing on re-entry? So we're giving people services conditional on being arrested or convicted or incarcerated, rather than saying, well, let's go out into the, into the community and say, you present with these same issues, right? And let's not get you into the system because we can address these issues. So do any of you all see that as a tension between like sort of reentry and non-entry, or what are the ways in which we could illuminate, the problems with non-entry by looking at reentry? I know that was a long question, so take it whatever part of that made sense to you and answer it.
I mean, I'll start and then see what others have to say. I mean, I think our standpoint is going back to the initial structure of the book. So our position is that we need to do all of it. So our position is that within each of these parts of the system, right? Policing, prosecutors, public defenders, courts, prisons, life after prison, and reentry. In each of them, there is a lot of work that can be done to make that part of the system more humane, more human-centered, less punishing, less brutal, more restorative. At the front end for policing, when you say non-entry, well, that's what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
If you send a mental health caseworker instead of a police officer, you are going to drastically reduce the chances that that person enters the system to begin with, and increases the chances that they might get some of the services that they need before they even enter. On the back end, what we're talking about right now, there is still a lot of work to be done. So I guess my own view, I'll just speak for myself. My own view is that it's a mistake to hold out any one of these pieces and say, well, instead of doing this, we should do that. Because to me, that's a diversionary move. I'm like, let's do this and do that. So my view is, if there's anybody on the call who has heard one piece of this that does not speak to you, fine, that's okay. You don't have to work on that. Focus on the piece that does speak to you and work on that. But I'm like quite resistant at this stage because I feel like there's too many people who use all of their energy to explain why you shouldn't do this thing. And then they're like done. And I'm like, okay, but what are you going to do? What's the thing you're going to work on? I get your critique of this effort, but what's your thing you're going to do? So that's where I land. It might not be this for you, but if it's not this, it's got to be that. The one thing that I think is unacceptable and immoral, given the human rights crisis that we're facing, is to walk away from it entirely and say, that's not my problem.
Yeah. No, it's hard work, but necessary work. And it took us a long time to get into this mess. It's going to take us a long time to get out of it. And any piece that we can do to sort of chip away at it, like working together, I think is the only way forward. So I see that Lonnie has reappeared, and so I think that's our time. So thanks so much to the panelists for engaging with me on this. It's a great book. I have it right here, and it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank
David, I want
you.
to thank you for a really great, sparky interview. I like how you went through the whole book. You made it very easy for non-lawyers or people new to the topic and maybe just lightly versed on the topic. I appreciate that you made it so accessible. So thank you very much for your time and your efforts that way. Panelists, what a so much chewy, juicy stuff through all night long. Many tangents that we can go down. I want to remind folks that both Maria and Premal and James, all three, are going to stay for after hours. It's a separate Zoom. How do you get to come to after hours? We've been putting in links all night in chat. Buy a copy of this incredible book. And reasonably priced, I might add, reasonably priced. Buy a copy of this book from our bookseller, The Bookstall. In your email receipt from the store is a link to register for after hours. After hours is a Zoom meeting. You can ask your own questions, turn on your camera, hang out, argue with, well, I don't know that I try to argue with the three of them, but hey, you're probably more bold than I am. Argue with these three folks. They're going to be there for as much as 55 minutes till 9 o'clock Central. We're going to give them a 5-minute break when we close down here in about 2 minutes. I'm going to run one quick question from Maureen that was submitted. She's a fan board treasurer, so I'd like to honor her with their question. She says, and whoever wants to answer, she says, I have a lot of curiosity, though it's a big question. I have a lot of curiosity about the business of incarceration and how that exacerbates all the issues. Maybe Maureen will come in after hours. You can continue the conversation. How can the privatization and profitability of the prison system be addressed? And I know you all have like a 2-sentence answer to that, right? I'm sure not. So whoever wants to jump in, we got about 2 minutes before we have to shut down.
Premal?
You thought the history of mass incarceration question was hard.
Around Premal.
Awesome.
I'll take an attempt at it. You're totally right that right, like money and capitalism and profit flows right through in all the parts of the criminal legal system. Debt is a major sort of way that the criminal legal system operates to further punish people. There are a variety of efforts underway to tackle the sort of profit industry around phone calls and video calls, for example. A lot of work has been done, how much it costs for people in jail or prison to receive or make phone calls and video calls. All sort of that's one example of a million kinds of contracts that private corporations can have with prisons and jails and departments of corrections. And so there's a lot of different avenues to challenge those kinds of policies and contracts. There's also, like I was mentioning, debt that accrues because of the way that laws are written in terms of what punishments are permissible. And then, of course, debt collectors and all sort of other sort of insurance and all these other sort of profit-making industries come in and get involved in those intersections too. So it is pervasive and in every part of the system, and is something that advocates should absolutely be tackling as part of this bigger fight.
All right, so Maureen, I hope you'll jump into after hours. Again, panelists, we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you all for your time so far tonight. We look forward to more. David, it's been a pleasure getting to know you. We love our partnership with Santa Clara University School of Law. We know there's a whole bunch, not just like you, but many talented people at the law school, and we hope to meet more of them as well. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. Come hang out. I mean, what an opportunity. These three huge minds doing such forward-looking work, to be able to come and just ask them your questions and learn more. That's what FAN is all about. So come join us in about 5 minutes when we open up that Zoom screen. And good night, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight.